Today on the show, I had the great pleasure to welcome Hans-Kristian Hoejsgaard. Hi, how are you doing?
Very well, Phil. Thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Where in the world are you at the moment?
So today I am in Paris, in sunny Paris, beautiful Paris. So a nice place to talk to you from.
Oh, great, great. I love that city. So Hans-Kristian, you have an amazing career in the luxury world. You're the chair at Bonhams, chair of Kalida Group, board director, Barclays Private Bank, etc., etc. You've had a very long and successful career with global brands.
Thank you. Yes, I have had a very long and interesting career, and it has been not by design, but by coincidence, I guess, that it has mostly been in the luxury sphere, but that I have enjoyed very much. And if you are a marketing person by training, more or less, then obviously that's a super nice sector to be in, to learn more and finesse your skills. So yes, has been a great ride.
So you ended up in luxury by random?
Absolutely. Completely by random. And I started out in my very first job in the champagne and cognac business, which obviously was the beverage alcohol, but in that luxury end. And so that's how I applied normally for a job like many other people did at the time.
So you didn't choose a luxury industry, it chose you.
Well, you can say that, yes. It sounds good in retrospect, but I think really it was more a coincidence. I obviously knew I wanted to be in consumer goods because that's what I have always interested. And it just happened to be the premium and the luxury part of it where I ended up. So whoever chose who, it was a good choice.
Great choice. And you spent there around 37 years or something, if I made the right calculation, if I may ask?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, yes. And I had the great pleasure of being based and work in all parts of the world, right? So I spent 10 years in Asia, I spent 6 years in the US, I spent 5 years in Italy, 6 years in France, and the last 10 years in Switzerland.
Wow, so you're basically a global CEO in that industry. What does it mean to be a global CEO? What kind of lifestyle do you actually have?
Well, obviously, when you are a global CEO in a global company, your job and your life merges because a part of being a global CEO is a lot of travel. So I have spent an enormous amount of time on planes and basically visiting constituents and colleagues and factories and retailers around the world. So life does become very driven by work. You have to be very conscious about the fact to choose your pockets of time off with your family and friends. It's not that easy, but obviously it's something you have chosen yourself. So I enjoyed it for many years, but was also happy when I became 60 and said, now I want to do something else that is less of that pressure, but no regrets.
No regrets. And for the family, they were happy that you did this. You said you had to juggle with that. How was it actually? How hard or how easy was it actually?
It's not easy. It's super important that you have a very supporting spouse. We tried to have 2 careers at the same time, which didn't make it easier, but obviously it was very important that there was equal opportunity. And most of the jobs we traveled to because of me, so it was always my better half who had to catch up. She did very well, very supportive, and found great opportunities wherever we went. But that's obviously super important that there is this teamwork and understanding of what has to be done. And obviously the kids were happy to have the opportunity to be acquainted with different cultures, different schools. They were not that happy at the time, but today when we talk about it, they really are appreciative of the opportunities they had.
So as a global CEO, do you think this has changed now since the COVID? We do a lot of video conferencing. Do you think a global CEO can now afford traveling less?
I definitely think so. I think if COVID taught us something, that was about the fact that you don't necessarily need to travel 6,000 miles for a couple of hours of meeting. So I definitely think the balance has become better. We cannot replace the human interaction entirely with Zoom and Teams, but clearly the demand on the actual physical travel time surely is less, and that I see myself in companies that I'm involved with, but also the fact, obviously, that alongside COVID has also come the whole ESG movement and the discussion around sustainability and thinking of the world. So I think those 2 topics in tandem has also made a lot of companies reflect on travel policies and trying to reduce CO2 footprint and carbon footprint and so on and so forth. So yes, less travel, definitely.
So how do you handle that? Like for the group that you are the chair of, like for example, Kalida Group, you're global, but you also need to adapt to the local markets. So how do you strike that balance between having global products and the local consumers?
Basically, the chairman's role is different. We are not involved day to day. That is, the CEO and the management is a very important split between duties and responsibilities. But we as board obviously visit once in a while our operations around the world and get some good consumer insights. So that has also, because of two-man teams, become easier.
You say you're not the CEO anymore, but you were a CEO. And I think when we met quite a few years ago, you were a cigar CEO. You were responsible for a famous company that produces cigars, Davidoff. How important is selling for a CEO? Is that part of the skills you need to have?
I definitely think so. I think that when you are in luxury goods or any goods, I think the CEO has to be the salesman, the top salesperson, in the sense that it is a brand and a company and a sector that has to be focused and consumer-centric. And that means that you are willing and enjoy interacting with consumers and customers. And that's obviously a selling job, that you try to put your best foot forward and try to explain why your particular cigar, why your particular perfume, or why your particular whatever is certainly something that the people you talk to should try and test and enjoy.
So you were a salesperson in a way. Do you have a little tip on how to be a good salesperson or a good CEO for that sake?
Salesperson, but any executive job, you need to have empathy. You need to understand the emotions and be able to put yourself in the shoes of your customer. So there is a sense of relationship going on, and building trust, you are building confidence and comfort.
Now, you speak about the customers and building trust. How is the shopping going to be affected in the years to come? Or the customer experience in the Kalida Group, for example. Is this going to be changing with technology? Where do you see luxury, a customer experience in the years to come?
Well, obviously, during the COVID, there was a massive change, right? And I think we had an acceleration of digitalization and e-commerce, which we would not have had at that pace and speed if we hadn't had COVID. What we are seeing now is that the pendulum is swinging back a bit. E-commerce, whether you speak about Amazon or our own websites, e-commerce is a little bit down again because people touch and feel physically. So I think what is changing, what will be a remaining feature, is basically what we call omni-channel, that people want to shop and interact and have an experience that is both physical and online, click and collect, and all of these things. So I think a hybrid is clearly evolving. And I think if I take the other business that I'm in, chairing the Bonhams business, in 2020, before COVID, 80% of auctions were basically live, where people were in a room bidding. And now it's exactly the reverse, maybe a little bit less, but there will be that hybrid because people still enjoy being together also.
What do you see with the latest technologies, the famous ChatGPT? Is this going to have any impact on Bonhams, on Kalida Group? How do you see that?
Absolutely. I think in all the companies I'm involved with, it's very much on the agenda. It's very much in the beginning phases, but artificial intelligence in particular is clearly something that's going to change, that's going to be an integral part of our business. In our drive for personalization, in terms of talking to consumers in a very, very relevant way, not just sending out something that is a mass thing that can appeal to many different, that we're really, really focused, personalized. I think that's where we see the immediate uptick and use of AI and many other new technologies. Yes.
So the personalization of the product, adapting to the clients themselves, that's where it could be the major change.
Understanding the consumer. Sometimes you have a very, very one-dimensional relation with, you don't know his or her other interest necessarily. And this can definitely help to build that, so one can more mine the data in a thoughtful way and getting stronger relations with consumers going forward.
What about the other ones, like Metaverse, blockchain? Does that play a role in the luxury world?
Blockchain definitely bigger and bigger, particularly in the art world, I would say. One of the big challenges or fears in the art world is the authenticity of a painting or of a sculpture. How can we make sure that this actually is a Picasso or is a Giacometti or whatever? And one of the things that has been feeding that fear in the past is obviously that there was no clear information stream on who owned it, when was it sold to whom, and all of that. Getting onto blockchain, so that would be a great safety valve for authenticity, and a lot of the investments in the art world goes in that direction.
And is the metaverse something that was a bit hype 6 months ago and is fading away now, or is it still here to stay?
I'm sure it's here to stay. It's not something that we are particularly focusing on in the companies that I'm with, but I know from colleagues in other sectors, yes. But it's true that the hype has maybe faded a bit, but I'm sure it's here to stay.
Okay. So AI, ChatGPT, blockchain, these are important things. Metaverse is here to stay, but that's not as 6 months ago. Now, if we see these big changes in the board level, you probably say, hey, the skills are going to be changing. The employees might have to adapt. What kind of skills do you see will be key for your employees in the years to come?
Well, it's very clear that there is a massive shift in terms of sets requirements, and both at management and at board level. I think at management level, it's easier because there's a lot of talented, young, digitally native people that are now coming into the workforce you can recruit. I think the big challenge is at board level, because board members are typically someone like me who is older, not digitally native. And when you think about the board's role in terms of supporting a management team, in terms of challenging a management team, in terms of developing things, if you don't have that knowledge, can you actually be of help to a management team? A lot of people had no idea what IT was 25 years ago, but they had to deal with it, and a lot of investments were made. And I think a lot of boards were uncomfortable in the big budgets that were passed and what is this all about. And I think we're getting into the same situation here. So it's extremely important that board members starting to get educated as well. They cannot overnight become digitally savvy or technology savvy, but that they are open to be trained and informed further. That's one issue. The second point is that I see more and more companies who, in addition to the traditional board of compliance and control and all of these things, are basically establishing advisory boards with very young people who have this knowledge, who then can help. They have no interest in being in a normal board because that's still not their world, but being helpful, advise, and challenge companies. So I think we will have that dual structure going forward.
But do you see this happening a lot, this advisory board coming to add to the existing boards? Is this a trend?
I know a few companies like Lego and others who are basically doing this now. One of the boards that I'm on, we're actually discussing that in a board meeting tomorrow also. So
very interesting. Now, you speak about the board members and how they have to evolve and bringing in the advisory boards to help. What about in terms of employee training? What will be the skills that should be acquired for employees to be successful in the years to come?
I think it's ever ongoing evolution, right? I still think that if you are in a customer-facing business or in a customer-facing role, obviously, as we talked about earlier, empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of the consumer, try to anticipate needs, try to exceed expectations is still super, super important and very key. And then what is happening now is obviously with digitalization, with e-commerce becoming more and more important, clearly you need to develop, train, coach, and mentor your team in terms of being more savvy in that area. And I think most companies also realize that if they don't have those skill sets necessarily, it is important to bring it in and make sure that you have a particularly focus on that. And thankfully, a lot of young people are taking training and education in this direction. So there's a lot of war for talent in this area, but the talent is there.
And now you speak about the war for talents. I understand that you made a lot of efforts also. You work in a company where you have, in average, 80% of women. And it seems that you have more and more coming in the board. So there is a lot of young female talent coming to the companies. So how do you see this?
Oh, that's super important. In Kalida in particular, has always struck me that 80% of the products are basically sold to women. But when I started 9 years ago at the board and the management, there were very, very few women. So that became a particular focus and priority for me, because I think it's important that we have that diversity and that we have that equal representation, at least, to make sure that we also have people around the table who is actually directly affected, implicated by the products we produce. So I'm proud of the fact that we have been able to double the female representation on the board, and that we now have a very strong female percentage in the top management as well. So I think that's important. And I have had the pleasure of being a founding member of the women's board award in Switzerland, and obviously have given me the access and the knowledge, the great joy to see how many talented women there are. Typically, women are more discreet, more holding back than men are, but they are there, and we need to get them out there, and we need to promote them and support them because we need them in the boardroom and in the management team.
How does it feel to be a man in a women's company?
I'm a firm believer in having both genders represented, so I think it's good. It gives a very different dynamic. I do not think it's great that the vast majority in a women's directed business are men. It doesn't make sense. Let me take the jury of the Women's Board Award in Switzerland. It's 7 people, it's 5 women and 2 men. And I think in something that is directed towards a particular gender, it's important to have that representation. But I do believe in the fact that the dynamic, the discussions are greatest when there is a mix of both genders.
Yeah. Diversity brings more ideas and brings us to a high level. I've seen that you work also on diversity and inclusion. You have, I think, Cosabella and Ehrlich Textil, 2 of the companies part of the Kalida group. They are more aimed at being more inclusive. Is that my correct understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. An important part of the attraction for us in acquiring Cosabella in America and Ehrlich Textil in Germany, what was their digital profile, number one, but also their inclusiveness in terms of brand positioning. So very, very important and very much obviously part of today's agenda. So that was something that was really important in our reflections on buying these brands.
Buying these brands, I think you played a major role in the shift in the Kalida group for the strategy, I understand. What was your thinking process when you went to buy these brands?
I think that the fundamental approach has been that since the underwear and lingerie market is incredibly fragmented, we felt that the Kalida Group had the opportunity to be a platform for consolidation, to be a platform for younger, smaller brands that needed maybe some power in terms of supply chain, in terms of internationalization, and in terms of design, in terms of technology, a lot of things. When we then went out, we also wanted to make sure when we looked at potential brands that they would also bring something to us so that we had we didn't need to acquire brands that would just be a copy of Kalida or bad. We needed to extend our reach. And therefore, these 2 brands were good examples. Ehrlich Textil, super young brand, 100% sustainable production, and inclusiveness is important. The entire marketing is essentially photos sent in by consumers, which is a super interesting, but very, very young brand. And we were traditionally with brands targeted at more in the 40s and the 50s. And Cosabella is our first venture into America and offers us a leading inclusive brand in America that we believe also has a great potential in Europe. I mean, also the Italian name Cosabella, we think could have a great opportunity in Europe. Number one. And number two, Cosabella, obviously also the company in the US, offers us a platform to bring Obad and Kalida to the US as well. So there's a lot of factors, but inclusiveness is clearly one of them.
Okay. And for most of us who have not bought companies or expand the reach of a group, how does that look like? You sit in a boardroom and you say, okay, let's define the strategy. And then what is the process of finding the companies? Then you talk to the CEOs. How does that work? What is the process to acquire a company like this?
Well, basically, the process is very clear. Once you have defined your strategy, as we had, we said we do need to make some acquisitions. And then you basically put down your criteria for the brands that you would be looking at. Is it a pure digital play? Is it a geographical play? Is it a age bracket play? Whatever. And you put all your criteria down. And then you either go to outside investment bankers or boutiques to say, can you come up with a list? Or in our case, we had enough force in-house to start trying mapping out the industry. Then the funny thing when you make your first move, then actually brands start coming to you. So we also had a number of that, well, we like what you're saying. We like your platform idea. We are too small still to be able to invest enough, so we could see an opportunity of being part of the group. So it sort of becomes a two-way street that you start out trying to look at brands, and then suddenly when people know that you are open to acquire, that they would also get in touch with you.
Okay. And look, just on the side remark, I was preparing our interview, and when I was preparing, I went, of course, through all the different brands of the Kalida Group and the other companies where you are chairing. And then I had a friend of mine who came by. She just came by behind me, and I was actually checking all your lingerie websites. So I said, so I said, what are you doing, Philippe? I said, I'm working. So I was like, all right, I work with insurance most of the time. So that was actually quite refreshing, just for the side remark.
People are always suspicious that you say you're working when you look at lingerie sites, right?
Yes. So that was, oh, well, I think Hans-Kristian has understood a few things I haven't. So anyway, more seriously, you're board member in several companies, as we said earlier. They're very different, from Bonhams to the Kalida Group to Barclays Private Bank. I mean, they're very different. How is that possible?
They are very different, but I think what is also important to understand that across these sectors, I mean, many of the issues are the same in terms of financial performance, digitalization, technology development. Whatever business you're in, you are faced with those same themes. So you bring maybe an experience from the textile sector to the banking sector, which might sort of feels odd at the beginning, but on the other hand, you have been through that journey somewhere else and you can contribute. And then I think the second point is that my particular background obviously has, as you said, been very much in the luxury sphere. And in the luxury sector, what is important, it is branding, right? And also a private bank and a wealth management outfit or a textile or an auction house, it's very much about branding, because when you turn off the light in the evening, what is left? It's really your brand and your people, right? So the brand and make it sustainable and having a clear positioning out there, I think goes across industries. That's at least why I have been told that I have been hired into these very different sectors because of that background.
Okay. So as you might know, we have quite a few viewers coming from the insurance world, also some banking, but insurance, a lot of them. What is your take on the insurance industry? If you have any ideas on the branding, as someone concerned with that industry, what's your view on it?
That's a tough question, Philip. I always feel that, yes, you can have an outside view, but before you really come with some qualified news, you also need to know something about it. But from a pure branding perspective, I think obviously it lends itself to be compared with banks, right, and the financial services sector. And branding in that sector is very, very much about trust. It's very much about heritage. It's very much about longevity. And I think that that's something that insurance company brands need to focus even more on, because I presume, particularly in consumer insurance, there might still be this perception sometimes that, I mean, can we really trust these guys? Are they salespeople more than taking care of my needs? So I think that whole trust relationship building is, from a branding perspective and from a company perspective, is super important.
Trust is key. And you're speaking about trust, and you work for family-controlled companies, publicly listed companies. What is your favorite? Is there more trust in one or the other?
No, I think each typology of ownership has its pros and cons. I have, though, said many times, and I'll be happy to say it again, that in the luxury world, I really do believe that the family ownership is probably something that is an advantage, in the sense that families do not think in quarters or years, i.e., they have a very, very long-term view on things, which when you build a brand, obviously that is super helpful and important, that you have owners that are not thinking too much about what's happening tomorrow, but want to be around for a long time. And I think I had the pleasure of working 6-7 years in the Louis Vuitton White Hennessy group, and I think when you see what the Arnault family have done to create an enormous empire now of brands, it was always with that very, very long-term view. So I think there is something to be said about family ownership in that perspective. When I then look at other businesses or businesses in trouble, I think private equity ownership is super important as well, because they're very focused. They can help brands get out of a crisis or survive a crisis and then basically hand it on again. It's a much shorter term, but I think all of these different ownership, I believe, it has its pros and cons. And then, of course, you have in the Kalida example, you have the hybrid, because you are publicly listed, but you still have a controlling family shareholder, which is a different dynamic.
Okay. But isn't that also a challenge when you have a family? Because as an external, someone who is not from the family, you might have less of a role in it, or you're not from it.
I think the key thing there to understand is that is there a clear family constitution in place? I mean, have the family decided who is going to run the company. Are we as family? Are we in the management? Are we on the board? Or we leave everything to externals? And that discussion is always difficult because you're 100% right. The big difference with family companies is that there are a lot of emotions involved, right? And the bigger the families are, the more branches of the families are. It's a known fact they do not always agree, and it's becoming more and more complex the more members that there are. So my first thing when I join companies like that is really to make sure, have you clearly written down what are the rules of engagement? I mean, can sister A come and say, I want my daughter in the company, or brother C come and say, I want my son in the company? That has to be very clear, because otherwise it will be very difficult for these external managers also to maneuver. So that whole discussion around the ground rules is super important. But you always have to remember, as an outside non-family member, that blood is thicker than anything, and therefore you cannot and you should not fight every battle. You need to focus on what brings the company and the brands forward, and sometimes you have to take one step back before you can take two steps forward.
So you need to be a good politician too, I guess, or a diplomat.
You need to exercise your diplomatic skills, number one. And something that I have learned is that you need to understand the history of the company in order to manage the future. I mean, history is super important, but you cannot become prisoner of it, because then you won't move forward. But you do need to understand it, so you understand the different agendas and complexities before you can help move it forward. So that requires patience, but also time invested to speak to all of the constituents and make sure that they're actually on the same page.
And it seems you have all the patience it takes to do that. I have the feeling. One of the last questions for today, you mentioned about ESG a bit earlier, sustainability. Where do you see the major risks for the luxury industry?
My concern is always greenwashing, right? I mean, are people really serious? Because everybody talks about ESG, it's on everybody's agenda. So that it's very important that boards, basically, together with the CEO, secure and assure that there is really a genuine purpose to become sustainable. And then it's super important also to understand that a company still needs to be very focused on profitability and shareholder value, because if companies are not sustainably profitable, they cannot invest in all of these ESG initiatives. So there is this balance that is super important to find. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is clearly from a supply chain perspective, and Switzerland is a country that through referendums and otherwise have put focus on the fact that should companies have a responsibility down the line, that if you have sourcing in Asia or in Bangladesh or wherever, that you do actually have responsibility for that as well. And I personally think that that is correct. I don't think you can politically decide in a government that now we will be tough with China or be tough with India. I don't think that that's going to work very well the way politicians work. But I think we as companies do have a responsibility to make sure that down our supply chain lines, that sustainability, all the way from footprint to human rights to a lot of things that goes into that, is our responsibility to a large extent.
Be the change you want to see in the world. Gandhi, I think. Great. Wow, that's very interesting. I would have plenty of more questions, but we're nearing the end. The next new talents for the future of the luxury world, and they're going to become global CEOs like what you've done, and then later board members. Would you have any advice to them, saying, hey, these are the things I should have done, or this is what you might want to look at to succeed? What would these advice be?
My number one advice always to these young people out there is you have to do what you are passionate about. Don't think about a planned career or whatever. Go out and what you really want to do. There's nothing worse than 10, 15, 20 years later said, I'm really sorry or upset that I didn't try this because I really wanted to. I think the pace of getting into a fixed career path sometimes is too fast. So I would very much recommend that young people take the opportunity to go out and try what they're passionate about, whatever it is. Secondly, I would say that the world is global, right? I think the more you can get out there and see the world, learn some more languages, will not only help you in your career, but also that it will help in our common global understanding, and then hopefully therefore a more peaceful world. And the more we understand about how other people, other cultures react, the better we are off. So that would be my key advice. And then I got a good advice myself as well when I started. It was that the most difficult thing about a job is getting it, which means that basically you have to have allies, you have to have mentors, you have to have people who help you in those critical moments, because when you start out as a young person, you don't have a lot of credits, right? You need to fight for it. So the importance of having people who are with your side or by your side, I think is incredibly helpful.
So follow your passion, learn languages, and have people on your side to support your start. Thank you very much, Hans-Kristian, for this very interesting discussion, very pleasant. What can we wish you for the next years to come?
I think we can wish each other that we will have a more peaceful world and that people will step back from the brink sometimes where you think you look into the abyss, and we really have to, at all levels, and it's not only politicians, but all of us have a responsibility to try and calm the waters a bit and respect that we are all different, but that also that tolerance is not the absence of having an opinion, right? We also have to stand up for principles, and we have to stand up for what we believe in. But I would very much wish for me and for all of us that we have a much more respectful dialogue going forward.
I love these words, so respectful dialogue. Thank you very much, Hans-Kristian, for this very nice interview, and I look forward to catching up with you in the times ahead. Have a good one.
Thank you for having me. Bye.